Alrighty, welcome to the first lesson of Unit 5. We're going to talk about something called the tragedy of the commons. So hopefully by the end of this, you'll get what this meme means. All right. All right. So before we get into tragedy of the commons, let's talk about resources. We've talked about resources before when we talked about Unit 1 and ecology and how different organisms use resources. But now we're going to shift to talk about resources in the context of people. So what we can do, excuse me, what we can say is that you have private resources and then you have shared resources. A shared resource is something that nobody really owns or that a lot of people use together but may not have any sort of outside management. A private resource, on the other hand, is owned by somebody or something. It could be owned by an individual person, by a company, by a government, etc. And usually the owner has the exclusive rights to get whatever resources they want to from that land. Now, sometimes, but not always, the individual will manage these resources to make sure that they're able to use those resources long term, especially if they're some sort of renewable resource. This is in contrast to what we can call the commons, which is not owned by any particular entity. Instead, it's used by whatever individuals come across it in a first come, first served manner. Unfortunately, this can have some drawbacks because nobody is really managing this land or managing these resources to make sure that nobody's overusing them. So let's look at an example of shared resources versus a commons. So first we have a commons here. We have a forest, and I don't know why all the names are Norwegianish. It just kind of what was in my head. We've got two guys who live near this forest, Jens and Lars. Jens and Lars both need to cut down wood in order to, start fires for their family, to cook food, to keep warm. So we're imagining this is like, 400 or 500 years ago before central air and heating. So they both live near this forest. Neither of them own the forest. They just cut down trees there. And so what happens is Jens decides he needs to cut down some trees, so now he's got some firewood. And then Lars comes and he cuts down some trees and he's got firewood. Now, in an ideal world, Jens and Lars would realize, okay, we've got to manage this because there are only so many trees. If we cut down all the trees, then we're not going to have enough resources. But what if Jens and Lars were like, hmm, I want to start selling this firewood? And if they do that, then they might decide to compete with each other for that limited resource and cut down all the trees until before you know it, there aren't any trees left. This would be a tragedy of the common circumstance. There was a common resource, and the tragedy is that people are mismanaging it. Now, let's say that instead we have a privately owned forest. In this case, we've got King Olaf here, and King Olaf has declared that this is his forest. Nobody can cut down trees unless he gives them permission. This is how things used to run back in the day. In fact, you could be, in certain cases, put to death if you were caught hunting or cutting down trees in the king's forest. So, King Olaf can decide he's going to let Jens cut down some trees and get some firewood. He could decide that he wants to let Lars cut down some trees and get some firewood, but he's got a vested interest in making sure that he can continue to have this forest for years to come. Maybe he's selling Jens and Lars the firewood. And so he can set limits, he can set regulations on, okay, you guys can cut down like 5 trees each, and that's it per year. And that would be some sort of oversight. Of course, King Olaf could be like, I need to get all the money I can as soon as possible, and he could decide that he's going to just cut down all the trees, because there's plenty of forest out there, and then sell it all to Jens, Lars, and all their buddies. So I don't want to make it seem like private ownership is necessarily the solution to this problem of the tragedy of the commons, because it's got its own issues too. So, what is tragedy of the commons? Well, a shared limited resource that nobody manages will usually tend to be overused and depleted, meaning it's going to be used up. So, that's what depleted means, if you did not know that. And so, this is because people tend to not plan, they tend to not think about long term management of a resource And instead, they're acting in their own self-interest for short-term gain. This happens when you have a lot of different individuals share a common resource without any sort of agreement to decide, I'm going to only take this much or you're only going to take that much. And so these resources tend to be used up fairly quickly. There are multiple examples of the tragedy of the commons in actual life. So, for example, when people from the European continent first started settling in North America, they first started settling, one of the major settlements was in New England. And one of the things that made it so attractive to live there was the fact that there was a lot of fish. The primary food source in that area, or one of the major fishes that would be caught, was cod. In fact, like the stereotypical fish sticks, I think up until a certain point used to be made almost entirely of cod. It was a very popular food fish, and there were a ton of them living off in the North Atlantic off the coast of New England. And so this was a huge industry. You'd have fishermen, they'd go and they'd catch fish upon fish and start selling it. And that's how they'd make their livelihood. Obviously, the more fish they caught, the more money they'd make, the better off their family would be. Unfortunately, this it took a while for governments to kind of think about, oh, what waters do we own? What do we want to do with regulation in those waters? And this is kind of a shared resource because fish don't exactly say, hey, I'm Canadian or I'm from the US. And so there wasn't necessarily treaties or agreements about how much fish was going to be caught each year. And then before you know it, in 1992 and 1993, the stock or the population of fish just collapsed. It got down to a point where, from having plentiful fish that was very easy to catch, it was very hard to find cod. They were still there, but they were in a small enough population that they were hard to catch. And so at that point, governments decided that they needed to step in and set regulations. So nowadays, there are limits to how much each fisherman can catch. They also have to have special equipment like special nets and such that will let like juvenile cod out. If you've ever gone fishing or been interested in fishing, you have to get like this is something more general in like Texas, even you have to get like a fishing license, I believe. Never fished myself. But there are regulations. If a fish is too small, you're supposed to throw it back because it's young and you want to let it live to reproductive maturity so that way it can reproduce and replenish the stock. And so without regulation, this common resource of cod was severely depleted. Now, with management, the cod stocks are starting to come back, but it's still never going to be like the amount of catch like what you see on this graph here. The Colorado River is another common resource. It is actually under the management of several treaties between the United States and Mexico, since we do share the Colorado River. Notice here the map that I have at the front. I mean, my bad, what front? At the top right is the watershed for the Colorado River. Now, this runs through two countries, the United States and Mexico, and it is shared resource between seven states in the U.S. and I believe two states in Mexico, but I don't know enough about Mexican geography to say for sure. Now, if you measure the outflow of water leaving the Colorado River Delta at its mouth, you get this graph that we see down here on the bottom. So the x-axis is the year. Note that this goes from 1905 to about 2005, so a span of 100 years. And then this is the flow in millions of cubic meters of water. Notice that the flow is steadily decreasing because at various times, multiple dams have been erected within the United States that kind of reduce the flow of the river and build up reservoirs. For example, there's the Hoover Dam here. You see the Glen Canyon Dam, a couple of other dams, and they're designed to hold water as a reservoir for resources for people to use, as well as to generate electricity, which we'll talk more when we talk about energy resources. But the result of that is the amount of water that's exiting at the mouth of the Colorado River has been decreasing consistently for about the past 100 years until you get to the point where in, for example, 1965 to about 1975 and various years from 19 looks like 90 on, there are some years where there is no flow, where there is no water running from the mouth of the Colorado River down to the Gulf of California. This is bad because there are some estuaries and wetlands in this area near the mouth that have ended up drying out because they're not receiving river. And this is because the treaties and regulations and such that are in place are not very well designed. They assume the flow of water through the Colorado River is much higher than it is, so they allocate each state more water than is actually flowing through the Colorado River. Which means there's like imaginary water, I guess, going there if you're a math person. And so that is a common resource that has been mismanaged, which is resulting in extremely reduced flow of water, which can be a problem, especially if you look at where the mouth of the river is. It's technically in Mexico. Most of the watershed is in the United States, so there's potential source of conflict there. If people in Mexico near the mouth of the river are using that as their water for irrigation, for crops and farms, as their water source for drinking water, then that becomes a conflict between several countries, which we'll talk more about when we talk about water resources. Another common resource is just our streets. I'm sure as you guys drive around or walk around, you see there's always trash on the sidewalk. Trash gets blown around, and if you think about it, when do we ever stop to pick it up? We think, oh, someone else is going to do it. That's someone else's job to take care of. But then no one ends up doing it. So unless you have fines or some sort of consequences, people tend to dump their litter outside. This is a picture from Dallas City Hall. I don't know the exact location of this, but I'm pretty sure you could go within any of the streams or creeks in Oak Cliff and see this kind of trash. I know I have when I have explored the creeks around Oak Cliff, and that's a common resource. When there are fines and consequences, people tend to dump less litter. But we will talk more about tragedy of the commons in class because we will definitely be doing some labs and activities. Until the next video.